All right, we are moving on to the next part of reupholstering our chair. I've got all of the pieces of fabric off of the chair and I am ready to rip them apart and cut new fabric. So I want to show you kind of the different things that we'll be working with. There are pieces like this, like the side arms that we took off. I've labeled them like so. They have kind of an odd shape, but they're pretty flat. These ones I can just put on my new fabric, trace it, and cut it out to be just the right shape, and I know it'll be the right size to refasten. There are some things that we will have to seam rip. For example, I've got the piping here. There's actually two types of piping that I've got for this particular project. One is kind of a double set of piping, and this is going to be interesting because this is the part that was glued, so I might have to get creative with that. Anyway, I'll have to rip this out and save the piping. There's also piping that just has one thing of piping. And like I mentioned before, I want to recycle as much of the chair as I can. So I will hang on to this piping and reuse it. And so I'll need to seam rip the casing off and use this as a template. Looks like I'm looking at about an inch and a quarter. It'll be a nice straight piece, but I do need to get that piping out so that I can reuse it. Often I can actually just slide the casing right off, and as long as I have the measurement, I can match the width like I need, and that will help save some time. Also helps make the seam ripping easier to not have the piping in the way. I've got this piece here that goes on the front bottom that has a bit of piping attached to the main piece. Okay, so I'll need to separate these two pieces, cut this as a flat piece, and then recover the piping on that and get it back together before I refasten it to the chair. And then we have our very unique and very fun chair back that is full of fluff and stuffing and goodness. So I've already kind of brought some of this out. This piece was right on the edge here. Okay, so this kind of, I have to take pictures of and be mindful as I go. I labeled this to know where it goes. It's kind of this piece that's off on the end. Okay, it was sewn together like this. I seam ripped that out, and that opens up, and I'm learning that we've got this interesting working in the back of it. So all of these ties, I was hoping I would not have to cut them, but they do tie in to the foam. So that's gonna get pretty tricky. But it looks like I've got kind of a tube of batting here, and it's batting and foam all together. So I'm gonna have to kind of seam rip as I go and release each of the sections of stuffing. I'm hoping, because I'm going to be working with a solid fabric that does not have as distinct of a grain line, so this is the fabric I'm going to be using to replace. Because I'm using a more versatile fabric, I'm hoping that once I get this front piece off, I can lay it flat and just cut one big piece instead of having to do panels for each piece to sew all of that together and then to attach it onto this and then to stitch everything back. You see how complicated it can get. So I'm gonna work my way through this and always keeping in mind that when I'm sewing this back, how that's going to come together. I will have to sew this back together with my machine and the foam in there, and it's gonna get kind of cozy. So that should be fun to figure out. All right, as I've gotten into this, I've decided to go ahead and separate those panels from the seat back. What I found is that where the seam comes together is made it a lot easier to sew within the seams of each little tube of fluff. So I'm gonna lay out my fabric and cut everything up and go from there. All right, now that we've got our fabric ready and cut, we're ready to put everything together and sew things back. So since I went ahead and I cut the different pieces of the back, I want to work in reverse order of what I tore it apart. So the last piece that I tore off was the left side of the seat back. I've got the cushions. So fun what it looks like underneath. Now what I've done is, just like I marked the old upholstery, I've also marked the new upholstery to indicate where it needs to go. I've also marked the foam. You can't see it very well. It's kind of hard to mark batting. But I have it numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that as I go and as I put this back on, I'm making sure that my numbers line up and that everything fits the way that it should. I went ahead and I sewed these first two pieces together that are on the end. The far end was not associated with one of the rolls of batting, so I want to put my number 5 piece of fabric on my number 5 roll of batting. Okay, so what's going to be tricky is that this batting is wrapped around foam and it's super thick. So going through my machine, I'm going to try to be strategic. Now I tore apart each little piece by piece, and it was sewn together to each of these ends. So I'm going to try to do the same, put it together the same way that it was done before. And if it's not perfect, it's okay, because it's going to hide within the chair and not be a big deal. Now I want to keep the batting for this first part on the outside of my machine. So I'm going to pin the seam to the outside here so that when I open it up, now as far as lining it up, I'm going to try to line the bottoms up, because the ends, the tops are going to get tucked in and stapled in a certain way, and it's okay to have some extra up there. The bottom is a little bit more precise, but there's some freedom there. Either way that I do it, don't poke yourself. Either way that I do this, it does afford some room on either side. So I'm gonna go all the way to the base. Now there was a strip of this beige fabric across the bottom of that. It's a pretty sturdy fabric, but it's not super pretty and the texture's not great, but it makes for, when you pull everything back onto the chair, it's strong enough that you can really tug on it and get it to fit the way that you want. So I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna pin this. Now when you are working with so much bulk and the batting and trying to pass this through a machine, it's gonna shift a lot. The batting is gonna try to push your fabric in different directions. So I don't always pin if my pieces are cut straight enough, but where we're working with so much bulk, I definitely want to be more careful and attentive to those little parts. Okay, so this is gonna pin all the way up. Almost there. Now when I'm done pinning, I want to just very gently open it up to make sure that it sits, that it falls on this piece the way that it's supposed to. So I'm gonna open up my gray fabric and wrap it around, and I see that my 5 on my gray fabric is in fact the piece that is wrapping around this, okay? And what's even more important is that that seam is going to be the nice finished edge, and it's not, none of my raw edges are showing. So it's just the way that I want it to be, and we'll run this through the machine. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to do this part, and then I'm going to sew the next piece on here, and then wrap it around number 4. And I'm just gonna kind of keep going piece by piece to try to keep as little of this batting going through my machine as possible, but should be an interesting adventure. All right, now that we have the seat cushion done, we need to get on to sewing this piping. So I took the piping out of its casing of the original fabric, and I'm trying to keep everything close because once the piping is out, it's kind of hard to label that. So I've got my old pieces that are labeled, and I have my new pieces. Now these are mirror image. Well, I mean, they're identical sizes for the back piping. So when I get the piping into the new casing, I'm not going to label it. I'm not going to label it right versus left, but I'll just keep these close at hand so I know where they're supposed to go. Okay, so as far as putting the piping in, I'm going to turn my fabric right side down, and I'm going to stick the piping in the middle. And I just kind of fold it over. Okay, and now at this point you can pin, and I'm going to try to not pin because I feel like I can keep a tighter grip on it. Okay, now I want to keep, I want to line up my foot to the edge of that piping when I put the foot down, and it kind of holds it right in place there. Now if I sew down here, it's going to be too far down the side and is not going to really catch that piping. So all sewing machines have a mechanism that can move the needle. So I'm going to move my needle all the way to the right. So basically I'm getting it as close to that piping as I possibly can. There's still going to be a little bit of a gap, but as I go, I'm going to try to really push my piping as close to that as possible. Okay, and I want that thread to be catching right on the edge. I'm going to move some stuff out of the way for a minute. Okay, so as I go along, I'm going to be holding this piping in place, and as you see, I'm letting my foot kind of climb. I don't know if you can see it actually. I've adjusted so that the foot is actually on the piping and that needle is dropping right to the side. Okay, and I can check my work as I go. I don't want to sew into the piping, and not all piping will actually let you do this. This is a pretty organic fiber kind of twine piping, but sometimes there's more synthetic like plastic, and I think I might be getting jammed up. Yep, I sure am. Okay, so I'm a little bit stuck. I'm going to fix this. All right, I have fixed my thread, I have adjusted my piping, and I'm going to pick up right where I left off. Now, as far as stitching, I'm not too concerned about lock stitching any of this because it's going to be stapled onto the chair and it's not going to go anywhere. But I do want to keep it close. Really? There we go. Okay, we're in business. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to keep that foot right on the edge of that piping, and that needle all the way to the right is just gonna, okay, and sometimes it slips off and that's totally fine. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just gonna be stapled in place anyway. So I'm just gonna keep on going down the line. Because the foot slips off of the piping when I try to do it that way, I'm not gonna be too paranoid if it does. And I'm not going to be too set on trying to get it back up. I'm just going to try to keep it as close as possible. I make frequent stops to just make sure everything is still lined up all the way down the line. Piping is definitely not my favorite part of reupholstering a chair, but it does give a really fun finished look, and you can choose fabric that is an accent and kind of makes a distinguishing line in the project. So there's fun things that can be done with piping. All right, so that is one piece of piping that is done. See that? So I was able to get that fabric. I mean, you can kind of see, maybe you can, where I got really close to the piping and then when I didn't get too close to the piping, but it's all pretty snug. The idea is that it's not going to easily slip out. All right, so I'm just going to continue and do this with the rest of the piping. And I will experiment with how to do the double piping pieces here in just a minute. All right, so I've done all of my single piping. Now, if you recall, there was that panel on the front of the chair that was attached to the piping. Okay, so I've got that piece here. I've got the old piece and I've got the bottom piece. Now I have these together so that I can see. I wrote this out so that I would know that this side is up and that side then is going to be up. So I'm going to fasten the piping to this. I want to make sure I line up the raw edges together. Okay. And when I put this through and sew it, when I'm finish it, it will have that hidden seam there and the piping will be on top. And then I'll be able to staple this whole thing to the bottom of the chair. So because this piece is pretty long, I want to just make sure that I've got it lined up the right way. The piping is going to go off of the edge of the piece for just a moment, and that's okay. But I do want to pin this in place. It's not going to be too difficult for me to keep it in line, so I won't pin. Well, maybe I will pin all the way down this time. Sometimes I don't. But again, with the addition of the staples, there's a lot more flexibility in how your stitches are going to turn out. But I do want to make sure that everything is lined up and flat. Okay, and I'm just going to go every 10 inches or so, I guess, just to make sure I line up right and that I have enough space at the end and that I haven't run out of piping or the skirt part. Okay, so yep, this is going to shoot just off the edge about the same amount as we were off in the beginning. So perfect. All right, so now that I'm sewing on this side, when I compress my foot, first I want to make sure that that piping is shoved all the way in, and my needle is all the way over here, so I need to make sure that it's closer to the piping, and I just turn my nozzle so that it gets all the way over there to the left now, so that I can really let that dig in over on that side. I'm gonna take this all the way down if my machine doesn't jam on me. There we go. And I take out the pins as I go. Sometimes I sew over them, but to avoid broken and bent pins and needles, I will take them out just before I get to them. And these pins are proving to be very helpful. I'm glad that I pinned, because there is some wiggling with that piping trying to get off of the edge of the piece I'm sewing it to. Got a little twisted here. Now there may be some special foot that allows me to get in closer. I do not have that foot, so just a normal standard foot can work just fine. And that's usually what I work with. And we are all the way down to the end. All right, so now that I have that all sewn together, when I unfold it, then we can see how that's got a nice, clean, hidden seam. And that's the piece that I'm going to staple. And that's how it's going to look on the front. All right, so now it's time to move on to the double piping. This is kind of and I'm just going to drag you along on the journey. This is the first time I've done double piping, so I don't know if there's a right way or a wrong way. But my thought process, first of all, I had to cut open, because of the glue on this piece of the chair, I had to cut through the glue to open up the piping and to get the piping out of there. So there's that. Now, I suppose my thought process here is that there's a couple of ways that I could do this. I could try to line up that piping side by side and wrap it in a nice little envelope and sew a seam straight down the middle. And that could work. However, there's quite a bit of bulk in my fabric, and I don't feel like I trust that I could get a straight line with that. So my second idea, and what I'm going to go with, is to take the first piece of piping and make an encasement there. And I want to encase it, I want to fold this over just about 1/3 of the width of the fabric I had. And because I had to cut open this piping, I really had to guess on how wide to cut the new fabric. So I'm going to go about 1/3 of the way in, maybe a smidge less, but what I want to have happen is that when my stitch comes in here and catches this piping, I want there to be only enough fabric on the seam allowance to fit that second piece of piping. Okay. That way, when I come back around, when I fold this fabric over, there's not going to be a whole lot of bulk that's going to get in the way, and it's going to give me a little bit of a gap. Okay, so do you see, I don't know how well you can see that, but there is a little bit of space on either side of the piping, so that as I fold this over, just on the other side of the fabric, the end of the fabric is going to be just beyond the seam, so my needle is going to be able to catch it, but I have a little bit more of a gap there to work with and to aim my needle than I would if I tried to wrap them both at the same time. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to do, and we'll see how that works. You'll get to discover this part with me. I'm going to start on this end, and again, I'm not gonna pin this, though I don't know, maybe I ought to, but I can eyeball my 1/3 pretty well. Okay, my needle is over to the left still from where I was working last time, so I'm just going to go with that. Okay, now as I'm going, I can see that where I'm wanting to place this is very conveniently lines up right with the edge of my foot. So I'm going to try to keep the edge of the fabric there at the edge of the foot. All you ever and never wanted to know about sewing piping, am I right? It's a process, but I think this will do the trick. I'm eyeballing that carefully, still trying to keep that foot lined up. And again, it's not going to be perfect. I mean, this is going to be, well, I guess maybe glued back to the chair. I'm trying to think of ways that I could avoid gluing it back, because I don't know that that was the most, I don't know, the best method to use, and just a mess to cut off. Not that I ever hope to reupholster this chair ever again, but someone in the future might. All right, so I've sewn down the line, my first set of piping. All right, so here we go. So my next set of piping, again, I'm going to lay it right there on my seam allowance. Okay, in fact, even just a little bit to the side so that I can see my previous thread line and the edge of the fabric. All right, and then I'm going to carefully fold this over and it should reach almost to the other side if I did thirds properly. But again, I do want to have that space between. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna line it right up in here. Now, I'm gonna depress my foot so that it just holds that in place for me. Now I want to make sure for this one that my needle is center, okay? And I'm going to keep the sides of my foot lined up with my piping. So each side is sitting on top of one piece of piping. I'm gonna fold over as I go. Because the piping is so bulky, this would be really difficult to pin. So wish me luck. My needle is centered. And here we go down the line. This is kind of a slow process. It's not a quick, it's not as simple as just a straight stitch. It's a little bit more tricky. But I just want to make sure that my needle is catching that layer of fabric and landing right between the piping. Uh-oh, I have shifted a little bit. So I'm gonna just jump a little bit. And this is so into the details that people looking at this chair is not gonna notice one little wonky stitch. So don't worry about that too much. And hopefully your first upholstery project or any upholstery project is not going to have this same issue. Now, if I need to kind of gather my fabric here up top to straighten out my lines, I can do that because this is the side that's going to be glued or stapled. This is going to be the side that we don't see. What matters is that bottom stitch, that it's looking clean and all that. We're getting close. Again, I'm trying to keep the sides of the foot on top of the piping, and I'm using my fingers to really feel where that piping is landing. And there's some of these parts of the fabric that are a little bit narrower than others. So that's interesting to navigate. I'm just doing my best. Okay. All right, so there we go. So I've got that all sewn in together. And on the back side, well, okay, that wasn't something that I thought through. So do you see the two stitches right here and right here? You can see both of the stitches down the line, and they aren't completely lined up perfectly, which may or may not be a bad thing.
Mom?
My thought is that I could staple, my hope, especially since this is gray fabric, that I could staple in between the piping when I refasten it, and that'll help pucker this piping, that maybe it'll help hide that bit. So yeah, I don't know. I might try the other way as well and see if I can get it lined up and then only have one stitch showing. Okay, here we are, attempt number 2 on the double piping. Let's see which method we prefer. Okay, so I think I'm going to go ahead and do my best to wrap this the same way that we did before, about a third of the way across. But instead of sewing it first, I'm going to try to wrap that in on the side. And why not? Let's go for it. Now, a lot of this is going to be flying blind because because I can't really see the piping. I don't have a stitch to guide. So this is different. But it might work. I don't know, maybe it'll save me some thread. Okay, I'm just kind of wrapping as I go, and I hold it in place kind of at the end, and then just let my needle fall right in between. It's not too bad, surprisingly, actually. Okay, oops, slipping a little bit. Okay, we're almost to the end of the line, so this is potentially quicker. Just takes, I don't know. All right. Let's see how the end result looks compared to the other. Make sure that my end, oops. Okay, so there we go. That's take 2, and that's my thread. And you can see a little bit that line. It definitely has just the one line, which I think has a cleaner look. So I suppose I could go either way. I still feel like I want this to pucker a little bit more. So it may just be placement of glue and staples, or a combination of both that helps me get the look that I want. But it looks like we could go either way. What do you think? Do you have a preference?